Shalom. שלום. בוקר טוב. זה בסדר אם אני אלמד בעברית? Just joking. It's great to see all of you, every one of you. We have a lot of Torah to learn today. We're going to do it the following. I don't want to do an introduction to David's Torah. Don't worry, I'll warm up. Don't worry. I don't want to do an introduction to David's Torah. I want to learn David's Torah. And then towards the end, maybe we'll reflect on what we learned and try to crystallize what was David's chidush in Torah in this world. And I like to divide our learning session into two. I want to learn a text with you, doing the impossible chavruta, meaning you being my chavruta. You're a pretty big chavruta. And then I want to send you to a chavruta session to learn another text and then to come back and think about what you've learned. The first text I'd like to learn is a text you probably all know very well, Genesis chapter 1, the beginning of the Bible. I'd like to compare Genesis chapter 1 with Brachot chapter 1. Now, what's the connection between Genesis chapter 1 and Brachot chapter 1? Genesis chapter 1 is the very beginning of everything, of the entire Bible, of the Torah. Brachot chapter 1 is the beginning of what? Of the Mishnah, of the Talmud. What I like to do is to study beginnings. I want to study the beginning of the written Torah and the beginning of the oral Torah, and beginnings are very important. Why are beginnings so important? What? It sets the tone, and it's the first impression. And you know what they say about first impressions? You can't make them twice. And the thing about a first impression, it creates the paradigm that you use the next chapter, the chapter after that. My question will be, what flavor do we get when we start the Torah, the written Torah? And what flavor do we get when we start the oral Torah? And maybe we'll be able to establish a tremendous gap between the two Torahs. This is the gap that my Rebbe, that David Hartman noticed. And this was the gap that was the foundation of one of the most important philosophical innovations. He tried to teach us all what the rabbinic revolution was about. But before big revolutions and big words, let's start with the text. Let's start with the text that we all know, and then the text that some of us might know, the first chapter of Brachot. So let's start our big chivruta with page 5, Genesis 1. Page 5, Genesis 1. Now, this is how I'd like to do it, since it seems like, according to the Torah, even though English is the holy language, but for some reason God chose to speak in Hebrew. So I'll read this in Hebrew, and feel free either to follow me in Hebrew or to put your finger on the other side in the holy language of English. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. This is the opening statement of the entire Bible, and let's admit it's a very dramatic statement. The beginning of the Bible is the beginning itself. The Bible begins at the very beginning. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In Hebrew, there is no word for cosmos. There isn't one word that represents everything, the world, cosmos. Not in the 5 portions of the Torah. The only word that we have is 2 words that represent everything, and that is shamayim va'aretz. Shamayim va'aretz probably means everything, from bottom to top, from heaven to earth, and probably everything in between. Shamayim va'aretz, let's translate it to contemporary English, means everything. In the beginning, God created everything. That's why I think we should understand this verse. But then it says, but in day 1 he created this, and the day 2 he created that, and day 3 created the other thing. That's why I think we should understand these verse, the opening verse, not as the first thing he created, but this is the title of creation. This is not verse 1 of the chapter, this is the title of the chapter. In the beginning, God created everything, and now they'll show us how that beginning that lasted 6 days, where he, in those 6 days, created everything. והארץ הייתה tohu vavohu. What does tohu vavohu mean? What does it say in English? Astonishingly empty. Interesting. Tohu vavohu. The truth is, we don't know what tohu vavohu means. The Greek translation translated this as chaos. And as a result, I think many of us imagined that the world before the world was chaos. But that's the Greek translation, tohu vavohu, as chaos. Has to do with the fact that ancient myths always imagined the world being a movement from chaos to cosmos. Cosmos in Greek means, I said before, it means everything, but it actually means order. The perfect order. Cosmos, right? Cosmetics is having order, having symmetry. Cosmos. And according to the ancient myths, creation is the movement from chaos to cosmos, from no order to absolute order. Is that the biblical story? I'm not quite sure. It says tohu vavohu, and there's only one problem. The words tohu vavohu appear only one more time in the Bible. It'll be in Jeremiah, and he says, Ra'iti et ha'aretz vehinei tohu vavohu. And we probably can't learn from that verse in Jeremiah because he's quoting this verse. So this is singular. We can't, it's hard. So I don't know what tohu vavohu means. And scholars have a tendency to think, but I don't know what tohu vavohu means. I just want to notice that it has a voice to it. Tohu vavohu. It has a sound. V'choshech. Oh, choshech, I actually understand. Even people that only know very basic Hebrew know choshech. What is choshech? It's choshech. Darkness. I think they mean here absolute darkness. That's the first thing I could actually understand from the world before it was created, that it was completely, completely dark. V'choshech al pnei tehom. I want to flesh out from the only what I could really understand from this verse. Al pnei tehom. V'ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim. Mayim I actually also understand. I think this is how we should imagine the world before the world. There was a lot of water there. We should imagine this gigantic premodal ocean. This is a scary vision, by the way. I don't know. It's a terrifying vision. The premodal world was a dark, gigantic ocean. A dark ocean. That's the world before the world. And then there's intervention. We have choshech and we have mayim, this gigantic, dark ocean. And then there's intervention. What's the divine intervention? Vayomer Elohim yehi or. There shall be light. And this great dark ocean is not absolutely dark anymore because we suddenly have islands of light within the darkness. And the next thing God does, he has an island of light. Now he starts creating order. Vayar Elohim et ha'or ki tov. Vayavdel Elohim. Now he starts separating the light from the darkness. Bein ha'or uvein ha'choshech. Now he starts calling names. Vayikra Elohim la'or yom ve'la'choshech kara layla vay'erev vay'boker yom echad. Then it's interesting. The first day, we have the creation of days. God had to create days in order to end that day. I mean, if he didn't create a day, he couldn't end the day. It would have been a very long day. So he created the concept of day, and then he ended the day. So in day 1, he created the concept of the day. That's what he created in day 1. And how did he create the concept of day? Because he created light, and what light did, it broke the totality of darkness. Now we have darkness, dark, light, night, day, vay'erev vay'boker yom echad. Let's move to day 2. I'm in verse 6. Vayomer Elohim yehi rakia betoch hamayim. Vayi mavdil bein mayim lemayim. We have this ancient ocean. And what does God do in day 2? He injects space into that ocean, and he separates the water. Vayi mavdil bein mayim lemayim. Now, where is the water now? It's either up high, sham mayim. It's either up high, it's either beneath, but there's a space in between. These are the two opening acts of creation. Destroying the monopoly of darkness and the monopoly of the totality of water. Now let's think about this. Now in between that space, between the Mayim Elyonim and Mayim Tachtonim, between the water above and the water beneath, in day 3, as you know, so the water beneath will also separate itself, it will have land, and the world will start evolving. This is interesting. I want to notice one thing. That the world created when God parted this ancient ocean. Now, I hope you all have a big deja vu now. Because how was the Jewish nation created in Pesach? By parting the Red Sea. It seems like the story of the parting of the Red Sea is a reconstruction of this part of creation. The whole world was created when God took an ancient ocean, it tore it into two, and our nation was redeemed when God took an ocean, it tore it into two. It's almost like saying all the forces of creation came back. That moment of redemption and reappeared in Yetziat Mitzrayim. It's a nice drasha, right? Rabbi, it's a good sermon, isn't it? For Pesach. Let's go back here. These are two dramatic movements by God. He creates light, he creates daytime, he creates nighttime. He separates night from day. He creates the unit, the basic unit of time called days. And then he creates after time. He moves to create space, empty space, separating the heavens from earth. Now try to imagine the awareness of these ancient human beings. Why is it, therefore, we have a good answer here, a scientific answer here. Why is the sky blue? Why is the sky blue? Because when you're looking up, what are you looking at? A big ocean. Jerusalemites always have to go all the way to Tel Aviv to see the ocean. But if you read this chapter carefully, you only have to look up. You're in the ocean. Now, this also helps us to understand the myth of the flood. What's the flood about? It's about the ocean above. I think we have this metaphor almost in every language about the sky collapsing, about the ocean collapsing. I know we have this in Hebrew, shamayim noflim, shamayim naflu alai. Do you have this in English? The sky, does that work in English? But something else works in Hebrew. I hope you'll appreciate this. What happens to a person that believes that he's living beneath an ocean? That the ocean is on top, and there's a myth that if you'll sin, the ocean will collapse, the ocean will fall, the world will return to chaos, to tohu vavohu. Everything will be, because that's what the Mabul, the flood, was about the cancellation of the second day creation. It's about the sky falling and the water from beneath coming out. It's like canceling the rakia, the second day creation. I would say that if you live with an awareness that you're living beneath an ocean and it might collapse, if you don't fear God, I would say that's a society with a lot of yirat shamayim. With a lot of, that works in Hebrew, with a lot of yirat shamayim means with a lot of fear of the sky. You fear the sky falling. What's our first impression from the Bible? Now, it's very hard to have a first impression of the Bible because for none of us it's a first impression. It's very hard to try to imitate a first impression because it's not. We read this chapter so many times. And still, if we try to reconstruct what's the first impression we get from the Bible, from these verses, the first impression, I think, we are introduced with an omnipotent God. He's powerful. He controls everything. He controls us. That's, I think, the first. He created light. He created space. He created time. Eventually, he'll create us. That's, I think, the first impression we have from the Bible. with that in mind, with God creating time and separating time and creating space and making room for the world. With that dramatic first impression, I'd like to ask, what's the first impression we get from the Talmud? I'd like now to move from the opening of the written Torah to the opening statement of the oral Torah, from the drama of Bereshit bara Elohim to the drama of the beginning of, and here I think it's in page 8. Page 8. Now, after the very dramatic opening of the written Torah, now this is how the oral Torah opens. How the 63 Masechta Traktat of the Talmud open with the following statements. I'll read from Hebrew. Please follow me in whatever language you want. Me'imatai korim et shma בערבית. מהשעה שהכהנים נכנסים לאכול בתרומתן, עד סוף השמורה הראשונה דברי רבי אליעזר. וחכמים אומרים עד חצות. רבן גמליאל אומר עד שיעלה עמוד השחר. When are we supposed to say Shema at nighttime in Arvit? And there's a machloket, disagreement. One says עד סוף השמורה הראשונה, meaning there's night shifts in the temple, and when the first night shift ends, that's the time limit of saying Shema at nighttime. Another person says until midnight. Another person says, actually, you have all night long. What a dramatic opening. The written law starts with God created everything. And the oral law starts with, when are you supposed to say Shema in Arvit? And there's a dramatic disagreement. The stakes are high. Is it until the first shift is over or midnight, maybe you have all night long? That's the first impression we get from the oral Torah. What do you think this is about? How is the Talmud drawing us in to its own world? It seems like, let's put it Spinoza has a very harsh critique on Judaism. And as the heart of his critique, as Judaism is about legalism. There's nothing there. It's about training people to submit to authority. It's not about love. It's not about philosophy. It's not about anything beyond authority. And if you look at the opening of the Talmud, what's the whole drama about? It's a legal discussion. When are you supposed into the very detailed legal discussion? So I once heard Hartman say, and it's a very, very nice observation, that the written Torah starts with a declaration, Bereshit bara Elohim tashamayim v'ta'aretz, and the oral law starts with a question. Me'imatai korim et shma, and we already have a different flavor of the two Torahs, but still, the Spinoza critique of the legalistic nature of the oral Torah of the Talmud that created different forms of our Judaism, that criticism is there, and I'd like to think about this because for some reason, the way David envisioned Judaism, he said that the oral law is almost a rebellion against the written law, and oral law is what created us, and his book, A Living Covenant, is a tremendous defense on the kind of humanity that is produced and promoted in the oral law. Now, I want to think about that while we read the beginning of the oral law. And I want to read this carefully because I think there's more to this text than it seems in our first impression. So there's a disagreement. When are we supposed to say Shema in the evening? If it's after the first shift of the priest, which is interesting. If it's midnight, or if it's all night. I'm moving to the second Mishnah. After we asked, when are you saying Shema in the evening, they're asking another dramatic question. What are they asking? When do you say Shema in the morning. Now it's getting really interesting. Are you in the English? It seems like it's all together. So let me find this for you because we. Where is it? 10 lines from the bottom. From when do you recite the Shema in the morning? The English translation somehow attached all the Mishnayot together, but this is it's 19 lines from the bottom. Okay, so if you could please count 19 lines, you'll find from when do you recite the Shema in the morning? That's in the English translation. After the word transgression, that's right. You have it? Okay, great. מאימתי קוראים את שמע בשחרית? מי שיכיר בין תכלת ללבן. When do you say shachar shema in the morning? And the first answer is מי שיכיר בין תכלת ללבן, which means this following question: when does morning begin? When can we start saying Shema? When does the morning begin? And when is that window of opportunity to say Shema? When does morning begin? Later they'll ask, when does morning end? When is it the morning? It's an interesting Mishnah. When does it begin? When does it end? When does the morning take place? And the first, it begins which means the sun, before it reaches the horizon, they say, I remember from my army times, that there was, in the army we were supposed to know how many degrees the sun is beneath the horizon. For the following reason: when it hits 18 degrees before the horizon, so the world is starting to light up very, very smoothly. And that's when, let's say, if you need to, you need to know when night is over, because then you have to start hiding. Night's not hiding you anymore. And I remember in the army, they said 18 degrees beneath the horizon, that's when it starts to light up. 9 degrees before, it's very lit. They're almost asking, when is there enough light in the world in order to declare that it's morning? And this is how they're asking the question. If you can differentiate between light blue and white, because at nighttime we can't tell the difference, but there's enough light in the world to differentiate between light blue and white, there's enough light in the world to declare that it's morning. That it's morning. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, ben tchelet lekorti. What is korti? It's a color that's lighter than light blue, which means in order to differentiate between a color between white and a color that's lighter than light blue, that means, according to Rabbi Eliezer, when does the morning begin? If you have to differentiate between colors that are even closer than light blue and white, even closer, that means we have to have more light in the world. Therefore, according to Rabbi Eliezer, when does morning begin? A little bit later. Okay, this was, I guess, very important for them. This is very nuanced. When is there enough light in this world to declare that it's morning? And if from the moment you can differentiate between very similar colors, that's when you could say it's morning. The question is, how similar do the colors have to be? The second half of this Mishnah is, when does the morning end? When is that window of saying Shema end? And they say, Ad He. The first option is Ad He Netzachama. That's Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkenus's opinion. Ad He Netzachama. What is He Netzachama? When the sun rises. So let's say, I'm just making this up, if you could differentiate between similar colors when the sun is 18 degrees beneath the horizon, so you have all that time till the sun rises. When the sun rises, there's a lot of light in the world. So from the first light until the sun rises, according to it passes the line of the horizon, according to Rabbi Eliezer, that's morning. After the sun rises, you can't say Shema anymore. The morning is over. You can't say Shema anymore. Meaning, according to Rabbi Eliezer, what kind of life are we all supposed to live? We all, let's put it this way, I don't know what time you guys woke up this morning, but according to Rabbi Eliezer, I woke up this morning, I didn't wake up this morning. Because I woke up. Actually, I think my girls woke me up beforehand, but the question is, the morning is when the sun already rises. Now Rabbi Yoshua is going to disagree with him. Rabbi Yoshua Omer, ad shalosh shaot. Quick explanation. What is an hour according to the rabbis? An hour is not what we call hour, it's something else. It's called sha'ah zmanit. Quick technical explanation. What they did, they took all the light day and chilku et ze. They divided it into 12 slots of time. That means in the summer when there's like 15 hours of light and day, so every hour, every sha'ah zmanit is actually more than 60 minutes. It's a 12th of light day. And in the winter, it would be less than 60 minutes. Meaning it's a 12th of light day. That's what Chazal call sha'ah. That's what they call sha'ah zmanit. Okay? So according to Rabbi Yoshua, what does he say? Ad shalosh sha'ot. What does that mean? Until a quarter of the day has passed. Right? 3 hours. A quarter of the day. A quarter of the day has passed. And now he gives the following reason. Why did he choose the random 3 hours? Which could make it till 10, till 11. Why did he choose the random 3 hours? He says the following. Shechen, derech bnei melachim, sons of kings. La'amod b'shalosh shot. Sons of kings, when do they wake up? They wake up at 11. He's asking, when people that don't work, people that don't work have no worries. When do they wake up? They wake up at 11, morning ends at 11. What's the machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua? It's a following machloket. It's a following disagreement. According to Rabbi Eliezer, Shema is when the sun rises. And according to Rabbi Yoshua, Shema is when people rise. But then there's a very interesting machloket. It's a machloket, when is it morning? According to Rabbi Eliezer, he has an objective, natural criteria to define morning. Morning, it's natural. When the sun rises, it's morning. According to Rabbi Yoshua, morning is not something objective. It's not something natural. It's something subjective. Morning is, when is morning? Not when the sun rises, but when people wake up. Then it's morning. You know how when when Sonny wakes up at 11:30 and he says to you with like this voice filled with, I just slept for 11 hours. He says to you, 11:30, good morning. Good morning. According to Rabbi Eliezer, he's wrong. He's wrong. It's not the morning. According to Rabbi Yoshua, when is it? He's right, because this is the difference. According to Rabbi Eliezer, people are supposed to wake up in the morning. According to Rabbi Yoshua, when people wake up, that's morning. It's subjective. I would say that if we try to make it here, I don't know if you guys, the coffee places in Emek Refaim, if you already master them yet. By the way, they pay me to advertise them, so I have so I would say, when they stop serving breakfast in kafit, that's more, it's a sociological category, according to Rabbi Yoshua. Now, the machloket in Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua is a very powerful machloket. It's a machloket about the nature of time. Is it objective? Does nature say when morning is? Is it objective? Or is it subjective? When we wake up, that's when we say Shema. The last person to wake up, he defines, or she defines, when the morning ends. Let's think about this a little bit more. Halacha, by the way, goes, the rabbi, halacha is not by Rabbi Eliezer ben Hilkanus, but by Rabbi Yoshua. Now, if anyone here knows the famous machloket of Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Eliezer in Baba Metzia called, famous sugya called, Tanuro Shelachnai, you know that this was their machloket. There, in Tanuro Shelachnai, the machloket was if the text has an objective meaning, or the text says what we wanted it to say, how we interpret it. Here it's that machloket all over again, not about objectivity of the text, but about objectivity of time. Now the interesting thing is, this machloket is the opening machloket of the Talmud. And I think it's the opening machloket of the Talmud because it captures a very deep tension within the Talmud. Now let's think about this a little bit more. The opening statement and the opening discussion of the oral law, what is it about? When is it night? When is it morning? When do you say Shema be'arvit? When do you say Shema be'shacharit? And they go into the nitty-gritties. Mishashi avdil. If he could separate. How do you separate between day and night? If you could separate in your eyes between tchelet ve'lavan or tchelet be'korti, can we differentiate between day and night? And when do we declare that day and night begins? Rabbi Yeshua takes it to another radical step. It's not only that we declare when day begins, not only we notice when the day begins, we define when day begins, and the halacha is by Rabbi Yeshua. Isn't it interesting that the opening conversation of the oral law is exactly about the opening declaration of the written law? What was the written law about? The day one, what's day one about? The world is dark, and what does God do? He creates light, and what does God do? Vayavdel Elohim bein ha'or uvein ha'choshech. God separates between light and between darkness and defines time. Vayikra Elohim la'or yom ve'la'choshech kara laila. The first act of creation is separation, is creating day and night and separating day and night. The first discussion in the oral law is about how can we notice the difference between darkness and light, and therefore day and night. I'd like to argue that the first discussion in the oral law is all about the first declaration of the written law. The first declaration of the written law is about separation of day and light, and the first discussion of the oral law is how do we differentiate between day and light. So it's about the same thing, just with one fundamental difference. It's completely different. It's completely different because in the oral law, in the written law, who differentiates between light and darkness, day and night? It's divine activity. And the oral law, who separates night from day? Human beings. This is one of the most important Hartman observations. The Bible is a theocentric text. God is in the heart and the center of the Bible. The oral law is an anthropocentric text. Human beings are in the heart of it. Human beings are active in it. Human beings are creative in it. But I think Rabbi Yeshua takes us one radical step forward. He says not only are we the ones noticing day and night and not God anymore, according to Rabbi Yeshua, it's even worse. It's not only that we're the ones noticing day and night. What are we doing? We're creating it. We're defining when morning is. We're moving from a day that God created to a sense of time that human beings create. The oral Torah is a declaration that it's about us now, and the movement, I think, if we see the two beginnings of the two Torahs, the oral Torah and the written Torah, we see a radical movement from a text where God is omnipotent, God is in charge, God is in control of everything, to a text where human beings are in control, and human beings decide, and human beings are starting to create their own world. Maybe these are two texts about creation. One about God creating the world, and Rabbi Yeshua understanding we are creating our world. Someone would say that chapter 1 in Brachot is a rebellion against chapter 1 in Bereshit. It's the same topic, but the opposite theology. This time human beings are in control. This time, and this language of seeing, this is what Hartman called the revolution of Chazal. But this Hartman understood it differently. It's not just a revolution. It's more than that. What do we have to assume? Because I want to notice something that I'm using very, very broad, very a very rough language here. I'm saying strong, there's anthropocentric text and theocentric text, and the anthropocentric text is rebelling against a theocentric text. And it's nice to speak that way because we have a strong sense of the guts that the rabbis had to rebel against the authority of God and to create their own world. There's only one problem with this description. I'm not sure it's right. I'm not sure it's right. And that's because in the end of chapter 1 in Genesis, in verse 26, 27, what do we have? The idea that human beings are created in the image of God. An empowerment of humanity occurs in that chapter when we meet the omnipotence of God. And vice versa. What is the first chapter of Brachot about? What is it about? It's that they're asking, when do we say Shema? And we have liberty to define when we say Shema, to define when day is. We're the ones who mavdil ben or ben choshech. We're the ones doing all the activity. God loses its role. There's only one problem. What is the Shema itself about? It's about accepting God's authority. Kabbalat ol malchut shamayim. It's like we have, the Chinese, the yin and the yang, where when two things are really opposite, they're not really opposite because, you know how the yin and yang looks like? You have something of the yin and the yang, and something of the yang and the... I feel we have something of chapter 1 in Genesis, the idea of the authority of God, inside chapter 1 of Brachot. It's all about Shema. It's interesting, the conversation about God's authority, Shema, is a conversation where while they're doing the conversation, they're undermining God's authority. They're expressing their own authority, their own liberty. And the text establishes God's power as a text that establishes God's power over humanity, but also empowers humanity. We have here two texts that are an interesting dialogue with each other. What's our time situation? No, I want you to, now let's do we have 45 minutes left? You're kidding. I've been speaking for an hour and 15 minutes. I've been speaking for 45 minutes. Okay, so what I want to do is now like this. What I like to do is the following. I'd like now to invest another half an hour with you doing a chavruta on your own. This is Hartman. This is what we do. And to learn a different text, again, one biblical text and one Talmudic text. The Talmudic text, and again to try to notice the different understanding of relationship between human beings and God. The Talmudic text I'd like you to read is from Tractat Tmura. Yep, it's in the very beginning. It's in the very beginning. In the English translation, it's from the second paragraph. You see, Rav Yehuda reported the name of Samuel. 3,000 traditional laws were forgotten during the period of mourning of Moses. You see the second paragraph? Page 1. From there, all the way until the third paragraph, what Othniel, son of Kenaz, did. You see Othniel, son of Kenaz? Yeah, 5 lines on the bottom. Okay, that's the Talmudic text. It's an easy text. I mean, it's not a halachic text. It's an agadic text. It's not a very hard text. And we have here another text, also an Agadic text, but from the Bible. What? Otniel. Now here, we'll be passing around another text from the Bible, and this is a text that discusses the tragedy of the death of the sons of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu. Now this is a story, a tragic story that I'd like you. It starts from chapter 10 that I'd like you to try to understand. Okay, so there's a lot on our plate, not a lot of time. We have what's the time now exactly? 10 before 10. So 10:20, we convene. Okay, 10:20. I mean 11:20. Sorry. What? What? And the first time his name is mentioned, not the second time. And the word Otniel, the son of Canaan, restored the forgotten teachings. That's when you end. Okay? Great. So at 10:20, we convene. Was not till 11? Because the hours I got was 11. Oh my God, I thought it was 11. Oh, so there's no Chavruta time for them? Yeah. Really? Really? Yeah, I know. So that's why I thought it was 2 hours. I have 2 hours on my slot just to break into Chavruta. Okay, a quick adjustment. We're in Israel here, so nothing's perfect. For some reason, I thought we had 2 full hours together. And they're only letting us play for an hour and a half together. So you'll have to, instead of study this text, to taste the text, which is a different experience. To taste it, we'll convene in 10:05. 15 minutes. Okay. A te'ima. Yeah, it's a nibble, yeah. Okay. Okay. Amar Rav Yehuda. Yehuda is what scholars call he's second generation of the Amoraim of the Talmudic scholars. Amar Rav Yehuda. And what's interesting about Rav Yehuda is that Rav Yehuda's biography is an interesting biography. He learned in 2 different yeshivas. He learned in Surah, which is the great yeshiva of Babylon led by Rav. And he learned in Nehardea, which was a great yeshiva led by Shmuel. And later on, he founded his own yeshiva in Pumbedita. Now, the reason why I find him interesting is because he came from 2 different schools and he grew in between them. He grew both from Rav and from Shmuel, both from Surah and Nehardea. This is Rav Yehuda, from the 2 great scholars that constantly were disagreeing, Rav and Shmuel. That's where he grew, from both scholars, not from one scholar. Now, my understanding is that when someone has 2 rabbis, not 1 rabbi, and their rabbis don't understand, that many times is a seed planted for greatness. Now, Rav Yehuda, that comes from 2 yeshivot, from 2 rabbis, introduces two competing traditions about what happened in that tragic moment, that tragic day when Moses died. And this is how he describes it. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda is bringing us a tradition in the name of one of his rabbis, of Shmuel. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. 3,000 הלכות נשתכחו בימי אבלו של משה. 3,000 halachot, 3,000 laws were forgotten when Moses died. It's almost like saying, when the giver of the Torah died, Torah itself disappeared with him. Or probably most of it. Trying to say, what critique is this of the people of Israel? That if when the giver of the Torah died, Torah itself evaporated. What's the critique here? They were so dependent on Moshe that once he disappeared, his Torah itself disappeared. I know someone that's not dependent on his Rebbe. Who's that? Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda himself is a person with multiple Rebbes, meaning he's his own human being. He's not dependent on anyone else. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, 3,000 halachot nishtakchu b'yimei avlo shel Moshe, trying to say that when Moses died, it was more than a personal tragedy. It was a cultural tragedy. It was a spiritual tragedy. It was an intellectual tragedy. The Torah itself lost. Our culture was lost. This is a culture that's too dependent on a leader. And then when the leader dies, the culture that he founded evaporates. Amru lo leYoshua, so they ask Joshua, Sh'al. They ask Joshua, please ask God what the Torah is. Bring it back. Amar le, he answers them, Lo b'shamayim. It's not in the sky anymore. Meaning, even if I'll ask the sky, where is the Torah? It's not there. It's the following tragedy. The Torah was brought from the sky back down to earth. It evaporated here. It's not there anymore. Meaning the Torah just doesn't exist. Amru le Shmuel Sh'al. Another prophet comes, Shal. Amar lem ele mitzvot she'ein hanavi rashay lechadesh davar me'ata. Prophecy can't create law anymore. It's forbidden. We can't, through prophecy, through asking God, reconstruct the missing Torah. מה רבי יצחק נפחא? אף חטאת שמתו בעליה נשתכחה בימי אבלו של משה. It was important for Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha to say that among those 3,000 laws, also the law of a chatat meaning a sacrifice you're offering for sins, that its owners died, and what do you do in that kind of a case? Also that law was forgotten. Very important mention of Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha. That among those 3,000 laws, also that law was forgotten. I'm sure, he had a good reason to add that. I'm continuing. Amru lePinchas, Sh'al, Amar le lo b'shamayim. They asked Pinchas to ask God. Pinchas said, I can't. It's not in the sky anymore. Amru leElazar, Elazar is Pinchas' son, Sh'al. Amar lehem, ele mitzvot she'ein navi rashay lechadesh davar me'ata. End of first tradition. Moses dies, the Torah is lost, and no one can ask it back. It's completely lost. Second tradition. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav. The same Rav Yehuda, what is he doing now? He's bringing us an alternative tradition from his other rabbi. This time, he's moving from Nehar De'ah to Surah, to the other yeshiva, to another rabbi, introducing an alternative tradition. Now I want to just notice the shocking difference between Rav Yehuda, the person who brings the tradition, and the people that the tradition is about. The people that the tradition is about are so dependent on the Rebbe dies, the Torah evaporates. Rav Yehuda that brings the tradition about the people that are dependent on the Rebbe, he himself is not dependent on any Rebbe. He has multiple Rebbes. If Shmuel dies, he has Rav. If Rav dies, he also there's another Rebbe called Rav Asi, another important Rebbe. And then he's his own person. He founds his yeshiva in Pumbedita. He's his own guy. And Rav Yehuda, that is an exemplar is English? It's good English, nachon? It's an it's a good example of what it means to be independent. He's bringing tradition two traditions that show his independence, but those traditions are about a people with no independence. בשעה שנפטר משה רבנו לגן עדן, when Moses left to heaven, אמר לו ליהושע. Moses, according to this alternative tradition that Rav Yehuda himself is bringing, there is a dialogue between Moses and Joshua, and he says to him the following, שאל ממני כל ספקות שיש לך. Meaning, ask me, I'm going to die now, ask me any question, anything that's not clear to you, any safek, if it was any vague when I taught you Torah my whole life, if it was vague, if something was questionable, uncertain, this is your opportunity to ask. I'm leaving now. And then with, I think, echoed arrogance, he says, אמר לו רבי, כלום הנחתיך שעה אחת והלכתי למקום אחר? לא כתבת בי ומשרתו יהושע בן נון מי שתוכל לו? Joshua says to him, you think there's anything I don't know? I was with you. I was attached to you your entire life. I know all your Torah. I have no questions. I know everything. He has absolute certainty. And then Moses dies, and how does Yeshua react? מיד תשש כוחו של יהושע, ונשתכחו ממנו 300 הלכות, ונולדו לו 700 ספקות. Interesting, I think what he's saying here, why did Joshua forget all the Torah that his Rebbe taught him? The movement from his arrogance to his failure. I think what he's saying here, he was so attached to his Rebbe. From all the reasons he thought he won't forget the Torah, he forgot the Torah. He forgot the Torah because he thought he was so attached to his Rebbe, now he can't forget it. But that's the reason why he forgot it, because he was so attached to his Rebbe, so dependent on his Rebbe, that when his Rebbe died, his Torah died with him. Meaning for all the reasons he thought the Torah of his Rebbe will stay, for those reasons, it didn't stay. Now as a result of the intellectual tragedy, Moses dies, and Joshua can't carry on because he doesn't know Moses' Torah. So as a result, what do the people do? ועמדו כל ישראל להרגו. All the people of Israel want to kill him now. This is a nice story. They want to kill him. אמר לו הקדוש ברוך הוא, לומר לך, God tells him, listen, I can't tell you the missing Torah, I'm sorry. Deal with them yourself. But then he gives him another advice. They all want to kill you because you forgot the Torah. I have a way to take care of this big rebellion against you, the people rebelling against Yeshua. First of all, I want to notice that according to this tradition, when Moses died, no one accepted the authority of his replacement. Again, not from an intellectual point of view, from a political point of view, we have a story of a people that were so dependent on one person. When he dies, his Torah dies. When he dies, authority dies. Itself dies. They can't accept the replacement. This is a critique of a type of leadership that creates dependency. So God says to him, this is beautiful. I can't tell you the missing Torah. Lech v'tordan b'milchama. I have a good way to take care of the people rebelling against you. You know how you can establish your authority again? Go to war. If you'll go to war, the attention will be they'll be distracted. What will they be thinking about? They'll have a new bad guy. Who will their bad guy be? The enemy. And when there's a war, leaders have a tendency to have all their charisma back because people like strong leaders when there's a war. And then the unbelievable pasuk. This is unbelievable. I hope. Please don't quote this part. Please. I'm just joking. No, it's okay. It's okay. Yeah. He says. What war did Joshua go in order to overcome, in order to distract the masses? That's chapter 1 in Joshua, when they attack Canaan and conquer Israel. Meaning, according to this amazing narrative, why did Joshua conquer Israel? Because he had a leadership crisis. He had to do something. Did you see the movie with Michael Douglas? Rag the Dog? Yeah? Is it Michael? No, it's not Michael Douglas. There's another president movie. No, Michael Douglas, another president movie. No, with Dustin Hoffman. With Dustin Hoffman, you see that movie? Yeah, see that movie? There's a scandal, and how to take care of the scandal. The oldest trick in the book. It starts in the Talmud. You start a war. Just only then they realize we don't have to start a war. To start a war, we just have to say we started a war with Albania, according to that movie. But here in this text, an amazing text, a real critique saying that what Joshua had to do in order to distract the people from the crisis of his authority, because he forgot Moshe's Torah was to start a war, and that war was the words of Joshua. And now there's a third version, which I'd like, a third version I'll read very quickly. במתנית נתנה 1,700 קלים וחמורים וגזירות ודגדוגי סופרים נשתכחו בימי אבלו של משה. Okay, another version of all the Torah that was forgotten when Moshe died. Finally reached the end. Amar Rabbi Avihu, third generation of Amorites, of Amoraim. You say Amorites, yeah? Third generation. Af al pi chen, the Torah was restored. We got the Torah back. Why? Af al pi chen, hichziran Otniel ben Knaz mitoch pilpulo. How did we get the Torah back? Not by asking for it back, not by God revealing the Torah all over again, but how was the lost Torah returned according to this beautiful story? By the way, it's a true story. How did this happen? They bought the Torah back using their own intellect. They figured it out, meaning, let's put it bluntly, the Torah was lost as long as they thought they have to ask for it, it's lost. When they stop asking it and start creating it, it's back. אף על פי כן החזירן עתניאל בן כנז מתוך פלפולו. We have here chapter 1 in Genesis, where God defines time, and chapter 1 in Brachot, where we define time. We have the two traditions, where the Torah is lost, and when you ask God, God's not answering, but when you ask yourself, the Torah comes back. This is a narrative of the rabbis about themselves. Something happened when we move from one book to another book. From the written law to the oral law. Something happens. We don't rely on God anymore. We rely on ourselves. We don't ask God. We ask ourselves. Meaning, what the Talmud is the declaration of human independence. And that assumes a theology. If you declare your independence, you think we ourselves could figure out when time begins. We ourselves define when time begins. We ourselves can reconstruct the missing Torah. It's not about God anymore. It's about ourselves. If this is a declaration of human independence, that means something. So that says something about the hidden theology of the Talmud. It means that if the Talmud believes that human beings could figure out God's Torah itself, that means that there's something divine within human being. In other words, this is maybe the heart of Hartman's Torah. It's a following understanding. If the Bible describes a people that believe in God, the Talmud describes a people that believe that God believes in people. God believes in us. God trusts us. And that's the foundation of what Hartman calls the covenant. What's the covenant? Here it is, and here's how I think it goes. And what's our time situation? 10 minutes. Here's how I think it goes. Hartman is a disciple of Soloveitchik. Soloveitchik he uses the term covenant in the following way. Soloveitchik says God created a world, and it wasn't a perfect world, it's an imperfect world. You just have to open the newspaper to realize that there's something really distorted in the world. It's an imperfect world. But God created an imperfect world with a purpose. Because creation is not over yet. Creation is not something that happened, it's something that's happening, according to Soloveitchik. And God created man, He created human beings, and He implanted in them the ability to create. How do you say, according to Soloveitchik, in Hebrew, the ability to create? That's salvific interpretation to the term Tselem Elohim, to being created in the image of God. So this is how Soloveitchik puts it. God creates an imperfect world. He puts it in human beings so they will perfect it. In that sense, according to Soloveitchik, there is a covenant between human beings and God, and it's a following covenant. We're creating the world together. God didn't create us. He didn't only create us, we are also creating the world with God. We're not only created by Him, we're creating with Him. And trying to make a world a better place, that's the covenant between human beings and God, according to Soloveitchik. Hartman takes the covenant of his rabbi one step forward, one radical step forward. He says, not only did God create the world, and we're perfecting it, therefore we're creating it with Him, God also gave us a Torah. But there are missing pieces in the Torah. And the Torah is not adapted to our times. And God planted in us the creative ability to interpret the Torah, to use the Torah to create new chapters of the Torah in the following sense. This is the extension. This is how I've come to understand Hartman. He's rebelling against his rabbi Soloveitchik by using his rabbi's language. Soloveitchik says, man and God have a covenant in creating the world. Hartman says, that's true. We also have a covenant not only in creating the world, but also in creating the Torah. Meaning the covenant didn't end in Genesis, in Bri'at Olam, the story of creation. It expands to Sinai. It expands to Revelation. We're creating the world with God. We're also creating the Torah with God. That's the covenant. That's the covenant according to Hartman. I'd like to offer. Now, throughout David's writings, the covenant became more and more clear. That there's two sides to the covenant, but throughout the time, the human part became more and more dominant. The radical movement from chapter 1 in Genesis to chapter 1 in Brachot, from the people being dependent on Moses to Otniel ben Knaz relying only on himself. These great narratives, which Hartman was a great storyteller of this narrative, was an inspiring narrative. It's an inspiring narrative to me to see Chazal, the Talmud, not as Spinoza put it, a legalistic text, creating the laws that I have to submit myself to its authority, but on the contrary, it's not a text that makes me small, it's a text that makes me big. It's not a text that shows its authority, it's a text that gives me authority. That was the big Hartman move about the Talmud. I just want to say one thing about the Hartman move, and with that, to start to end our large chavruta together. I think there's something to say about chapter 1 in Genesis and chapter 1 in Brachot and the great tension between the two, and I pointed as yin and yang, and I'm not sure that we should think about the way Hartman tries to present it as there's a progress from one chapter to the other chapter, from God to man. There's a great story of progress and the declaration of independence of human beings from God, this great Nietzschean move within the Talmud. I think I'd like to do something very Hartman-like and to offer a different reading of this move. A different reading from my Rebbe, from Hartman. And that is, by the way, I heard once from Hartman that he said that he's a real disciple of Soloveitchik because all the disciples of Soloveitchik, they express the fact that disciples by agreeing with him. And he takes Soloveitchik so seriously that he disagrees with him. And I'd like to follow Hartman's signal here and offer a different reading of the narrative, the Bible, and the Talmud. And maybe if you think about it a little bit differently. We're thinking here about a great tension, a great creative tension between the two books, between the two worlds. The theocentric text that's represented in the Bible, as Hartman put it, and the anthropocentric text that's represented in the Talmud, as Hartman put it. But maybe we're not moving from Bible to Talmud. Maybe we're still there in the tension between the Bible and the Talmud. Let me explain this point. There's a beautiful line in the Mishnah in Avot. Someone says like this: Kol chayai gadalti ben chachamim. My entire life I've grown in between scholars. Kol chayai gadalti ben chachamim. It's a nice line. I think it's a nice line. I think it's a great critique of Western civilization, because in Western civilization, our concept of time is that our life is divided into two. There's a period where we grow, and there is a period when we're finally grown up. One day you're grown up. And I think the Mishnah is saying, you're never grown up. Kol chayai gadalti. My entire life I'm growing. I'm never grown up. So it's an important observation of how we experience time. But that's not why I'm quoting this line. I'm quoting this line for another reason. He says in the end, Kol chayai gadalti ben chachamim. My entire life I grew in between scholars. In the 18th century, Rabbi Nachman Breslev, you know Rabbi Nachman? He writes a great Torah about this line. And this is how he says the Torah. He says, Kol chayai gadalti ben chachamim. Rabbi Nachman asks, where do you grow? Where do you grow? And his answer is, ben chachamim. You don't grow from scholars. You learn from the space that's created in between scholars. Ben chachamim. Like Rav Yehuda. What was Rav Yehuda's special day? Joshua had one Rebbe. His Rebbe died, he lost everything. Rav Yehuda grew in the space between two Rebbes, Rav and Shmuel. Kol chayai gadalti ben chachamim. Not from scholars, but from the space that they create in between them. Now, what always exists, ask Rabbi Nachman from Breslev, what always exists, according to Jewish tradition, between scholars? When you open the Mishnah, when you open the Talmud, what always exists in between, in the space between scholars? What do you always have between them? A disagreement. Rabbi Nachman says, Sham gadalti. That's where I grew. I didn't grow from listening to Torah from scholars. I grew from the tension, from the disagreement that's in between them. This agreement between Hillel and Shammai, and Rav and Shmuel, and Vraba and Abaye. And if we expand that, Plato and Aristotle, and Hartman and Soloveitchik. I grew from the space in between. Now, what's the difference between a person that grows from one school of thought, has one Rebbe? To what height could that person grow if you have one Rebbe in one school of thought? You develop dependency, and to what height can you grow? What? Maybe you don't grow, and maybe you grow to the height of your Rebbe, but if you grow in between Rebbes, in between schools of thought, what height can you grow? I think you grow to your own height, to wherever you take yourself. Rav Yehuda brings two traditions, and the traditions about unliberated people. We're introduced here two schools of thought, represented in the first impression of the Torah, the written Torah, and the first impression of the oral Torah. Different worlds. I think both worlds exist, and both worlds, the tension between the written law and the oral law, between the theocentric world and an anthropocentric world, that tension is the space where the Jewish world always grew. Kol chayai gadalti ben chachamim. I think, and this is where my machloket with my Rebbe is, it's not that we're moving from one text to another text. We're growing not from this text to that text. We're growing from the space between these texts and between these authorities and between these worlds. And I'm an Israeli, so let me say something about Israel. Part of the sickness of Israel, I think, is that we don't have this tension. In the following sense, either it's all about us and there's no divine authority. There's no tradition. We shook everything off. We created what Jabotinsky called Geza Psychologi Chadash El Yehudim, a new psychological breed of Jews that has no authority, this new Nietzschean Jew that shakes all authority off of God, tradition, and the Goyim. We don't listen to anyone anymore. Yeah, shmum, it's all about us. And Orthodox Israel, it's only about authority. It's not about us. It's never about us. Our impulses, our intuition, our understandings don't count anymore. We have to completely surrender. I would say our problem is that we cancel the tension. Either we're completely liberated from authority, either we erased authority or we erased ourselves. And coming back to an important concept of my Rebbe of Hartman, I want to develop, I think Hartman thought that the best way to understand our relationship with our tradition is a dialogue. A dialogue means I would say some Israelis don't have dialogue because you don't have a person reading. You completely erase yourself and submit yourself to the authority of tradition. So the dialogue has to have two sides. But there's another side of Israel where there's no dialogue. Why? Not because there's no reader, but because there's no tradition. There's no dialogue. In order to reconstruct a dialogue, in order to create a very sophisticated world, where on the one hand, like in Brachot, we're speaking about Shema, about accepting God's authority, but the way we're speaking about it, we're expressing our own authority. That paradox, that living paradox, is a paradox. I think the real legacy of Hartman is how do we live that paradox in Israel, in North America, and create a Jewish world which is paradoxical Jews. This is, I think, the real attention of Hartman. Paradoxical Jews, where on the one hand, you're modest and you accept authority, and on the other hand, at the same time, you rebel against it. I think a good way to put it, how do we reconstruct the tension between the books? Ben Chachamim, between the worlds, between a world where God is in the center, or a world where we're in the center. There's no easy way to put it besides to create, like Rabbi Nachman put it, a space in between those worlds where we can create in that space our own world. Pretty dramatic. Toda Rabba.